Chester Borrows.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in favour of the Private Security Personnel and Private Investigators Bill, and it is one that came before the Justice and Electoral Committee, and it was one that the committee members applied themselves to in a very studious way and sought wide consultation with it. We did have a number of people submit to us, and a lot of those submitters came from the industry, and there were some people who were submitting as individuals with some concerns that they had around where part of the bill might be going, and that did relate to the ability of private investigators to be able to take photographs, to videotape, and to use listening devices as well. I think the main thrust of the bill was that technology had moved on to a place where it had never been envisaged at the time that it was initially, or the Act that it was replacing in 1974. And we had a very graphic presentation from Trevor Morley, who had previously been the president of the relevant industry association. And he brought before the committee a number of pieces of fairly basic technology like cell phones, like digital cameras and the like, and made the point that although these were seen as common and everyday items in most people's possession, they were not allowed to be used in certain ways by private investigators, bearing in mind that private investigators have been through a certification process and have been through a vetting process, and so they were apparently more trusted than the average member of the public, yet not more trusted than the average member of the public when it came to doing things like taking photographs and sound recordings. And the ridiculous situation we had, for instance, is that if I, as a concerned parent, instructed a private investigator to go and look for my miscreant 15-year-old runaway daughter, then I could give the private investigator a photograph of my daughter and say, this is the girl I want you to go and look for, but the private investigator can't, under current law, show that photograph to anyone else and say, have you seen it? But he could stand in front of that person and say, well, she's about, 5'6" and she's got brown hair and green eyes and all the rest of it. Now, is that ridiculous or is that just dumb? And so that is why this bill has been brought before the House, and of course there are a number of other measures that relate to security guards and personal guards and a number of positions that will become invaluable during the smooth running of the Rugby World Cup next year, and hence one of the reasons why we need to have this legislation through quite quickly. We did have a discussion, as previously mentioned by Jacinda Ardern, around Clause 66. There was certainly some reservations held by a number of members of Parliament in respect of it. Two of them in particular, one from each side of the House, had been subject of ongoing videotaping of his house, or their houses, at the time. One of them, and we also then had a ridiculous situation, for instance, where although a private investigator can't put a videotape on a person's home as a private investigator, he can approach the neighbour of somebody who he wants to film and get them to do the videotaping from their place, and it is completely without any sanction whatsoever. Of course, many of these private investigators acting in that way are contracted by newspapers and other media outlets. They can't do it, but a journalist can. So the person who gets to write the story is able to do the taping or the sound recording or the photography, but the certificated, vetoed private investigator can't. And that seems a bit silly. There was one other point I just want to touch on, and that is in relation to training. It was suggested initially that those people seeking certification under new provisions would be required to go through training, and it was, in the end, it was decided that this should really be a display of competency, bearing in mind a lot of people who are going to be working in this field have previously been working there for a number of years, and this display of competency and ability is probably far more important than sitting in a classroom and undergoing X number of hours of training. So we look forward to the relatively smooth passing of this bill. We recognise that there are a couple of matters of contention, particularly with the Green Party and the Labor Party, but in the end, I think people can see that if you're going to extend powers, better to have those powers extended to people who are certificated and do have an accountability rather than people, members of the public who aren't. We also have to remember too that at the same time we have the transition of the search and surveillance bill, which is looking at regulating the ability of states' agents and their abilities to do similar activities. And so if we're constraining those activities, then we should be constraining or at least monitoring and regulating for those of the private security personnel and private investigators. Thank you.